I one day was walking down the street on Fifth Avenue and I saw an airline crew come out of a hotel, and I thought to myself, boy, if I could get this uniform and I could become a pilot, then I'd walk in the bank as a pilot. That would give me such credibility.
Your flight number showed your ID, they'd give me a key, I'd stay 2 or 3 days, and Pan Am would be direct billed for my room and my meals.
Use various occupations. For example, the airline pilot with Pan American.
Did you actually fly on a plane?
Well, I would fly up in the cockpit so that I could fly for free. And I had a uniform.
Frank Abagnale Jr. is being transported back to the United States. He's a wanted fraudster, arrested in Europe, facing prison. The chase appears to be over. Then, somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean, Frank asks to use the bathroom. Moments later, he's gone. According to the story that would later make him famous, Abagnale escaped through an airplane toilet and disappeared into the darkness below. It sounds impossible, and that's exactly why people remember it. Over the next several decades, Frank Abagnale would become one of the most famous conmen in the world. His story inspired a best-selling autobiography, a hit Hollywood film starring Leonardo DiCaprio, a Broadway musical, and a lucrative second career built around explaining how he fooled banks, businesses, and law enforcement. But here's where things get complicated, because the more journalists investigated Frank's story, the more questions they found. Did he really impersonate a pilot for years? Did he really outsmart the FBI across dozens of countries? And did the famous airplane escape happen the way he claimed? The deeper people looked, the harder it became to separate fact from fiction. So who was Frank Abagnale Jr. really? A master criminal? A master storyteller? Or perhaps the greatest con of his life wasn't the check he forged, but the story he told afterward? To answer that, we need to go back to where the scam actually began. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born in 1948 and grew up in Bronxville, New York. By most accounts, his early childhood was relatively ordinary, but things changed when his parents' marriage began to fall apart. When Frank was still a teenager, his parents divorced. He eventually moved in with his father and stepmother, carrying with him the confusion and instability that often follows a family breakup. Around this same period came the first documented fraud that would later become part of his story. Frank's father had given him a gasoline credit card. It was supposed to be a convenience, a sign of trust. Instead, Frank saw an opportunity. According to his own account, he used the card to generate cash for himself while the charges landed on his father's bill. By the time the scheme was discovered, thousands of dollars had been charged. And more important than money was the lesson, because you start to realise something. People rarely inspect trust too closely. A credit card works because people assume it's being used honestly. A signature works because people assume it's genuine. A confident explanation works because most people want it to be true. You don't need force, you need belief. And Frank seemed unusually good at creating it. He could be charming, confident, quick with an answer, the kind of person who made people feel comfortable before they had a reason to be suspicious. For a teenager, it was a powerful discovery. If you tell the right story, people often fill in the missing details themselves. But how far could that really take him? Could a few scams satisfy him? Could he stop before the consequences caught up? Or had Frank just discovered something far more addictive than money? Because before long, he would stop testing credit cards and start testing identity. In Frank's first fraud taught him the value of trust. The next few years taught him something else. Authority could be borrowed, and sometimes all it took was a costume. In December 1964, at just 16 years old, Frank enlisted in the US Navy. The military offered structure, discipline, and a chance to start over. It lasted less than 3 months. By February 1965, he had been discharged. What followed wasn't the rise of a criminal mastermind. It was the rapid escalation of a teenager making increasingly reckless decisions, petty theft, small scams, shortcuts. Then came one of the strangest incidents in his early criminal record. Frank posed as a police officer. Armed with a toy gun and a paper badge, he entered a woman's apartment claiming he was investigating her daughter. The story unravelled quickly. Police were called and Frank was arrested. A judge ordered him sent to a psychiatric institution for observation. But even that didn't slow him down. A few months later, he stole a neighbour's Ford Mustang and headed west, financing a cross-country trip with stolen blank checks. And, high on adrenaline, you start noticing something. A uniform changes how people treat you. A badge changes what they'll believe. People don't just trust authority, they often trust the appearance of authority. And Frank was becoming increasingly comfortable exploiting that fact. Not through elaborate schemes, not through genius level planning, just confidence, nerve, and a growing belief that he could talk his way through almost anything. But every successful deception pushes the boundary a little further. Every lie creates a bigger lie behind it. And soon, Frank would discover that pretending to be a police officer was only scratching the surface. Because if people would trust a fake badge, what else might they believe? By the summer of 1965, Frank Abagnale's luck was running out. After a series of thefts and check-related offences, he was arrested and convicted. This time, the consequences were serious. Frank was sentenced to Great Meadow Correctional Facility in upstate New York, and for the next several years, prison, not airports, hospitals, or courtrooms, would be his reality. At first glance, this might not seem particularly important, but decades later, it would become one of the most debated parts of the entire Frank Abagnale story. Because if you've seen Catch Me If You Can, or heard Frank speak about his past, you probably know the version where a teenage con artist is travelling the world, impersonating professionals, forging checks, and constantly staying one step ahead of the authorities. It's a great story. The problem is that prison records tell a different one. Modern researchers who examined court documents and incarceration records found that Frank spent much of the period during which some of his most famous adventures supposedly occurred behind bars at Great Meadow. That doesn't mean every story is false. It doesn't mean nothing happened. But it does raise questions, important questions. How much of the legend matches the historical record? How much was simplified, exaggerated, or perhaps transformed over time into something more entertaining than reality? For now, those questions remain in the background. Because whatever Frank would eventually become, a fraudster, a celebrity, a consultant, or a storyteller, his life was still very much headed in the wrong direction. When he was finally released in late 1968, he was no longer a reckless teenager with a stolen credit card. He was a convicted criminal looking for a fresh start, or perhaps a fresh identity. And before long, Frank Abagnale would begin reinventing himself all over again. Frank Abagnale walked out of prison on December 24, 1968. He was 20 years old, a convicted criminal, a young man with few legitimate opportunities and a growing talent for becoming whoever people expected him to be. Not long after his release, he resurfaced in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This time, Frank wasn't introducing himself as an ex-convict. He was introducing himself as a pilot, specifically a Trans World Airlines pilot. To support the story, he carried falsified airline identification and presented himself with the confidence of someone who belonged in the role. And for a while, it worked. People trusted him.
On the taxi out, always the same question. So, Bob, how long have you been with Pan Am? Been flying about 7 years. What position you fly? Right seat, which is airline terminology for a co-pilot. What type of equipment are you on? Had that one down. Perfect.
They welcomed him into their homes. They introduced him to friends, colleagues, and local professionals. One local minister became particularly impressed and helped Frank make connections within the community. The pattern was becoming familiar. You don't need people to trust you forever. You only need them to trust you today. Long enough to get through the door. Long enough to avoid questions. Long enough to move on before the story falls apart. For Frank, charm was often more valuable than any forged document. A fake ID might get someone's attention. Confidence kept them from looking closer. But eventually, someone did. The minister who had helped Frank began checking parts of his story. Questions were asked. TWA was contacted. The answers didn't match. The pilot wasn't a pilot. The credentials weren't legitimate. And when investigators looked further, they discovered more problems. Frank had allegedly stolen blank checks from his host family. Checks from a local business had also disappeared. On February 14, 1969, Valentine's Day, he was arrested. Convicted of theft and forgery, he received a lengthy probation sentence. For most people, that would have been the end of the road. A warning, a second chance, an opportunity to stop running. But Frank Abagnale had spent years escaping consequences, and instead of serving probation, instead of staying put, instead of accepting the life in front of him, Frank made a different choice. He ran. And this time, he left America behind. Instead of reporting to probation officers and trying to rebuild his life, Frank Abagnale chose a different path. He left America. By 1969, he was moving across Europe, staying one step ahead of the consequences waiting for him back home. France, Sweden, different countries, same pattern. Fraud, forgery, theft. You tell yourself that a new country is a fresh start, a new language, new faces, new opportunities. Nobody knows your history. Nobody knows your name. But eventually, every lie runs into reality. In France, Frank was arrested after stealing a car and defrauding two families in Sweden. The run that had begun in Louisiana was suddenly coming apart. This time, there was no easy explanation. No quick escape, no new identity waiting around the corner. A French court sentenced him to prison. For months, the walls got smaller. The options got fewer. And perhaps, for the first time in years, the future seemed largely out of his control. But things were about to get worse. After serving time in France, Frank was extradited to Sweden, where he was convicted again, this time for fraud by forgery. More prison, more consequences, more doors closing. You start to feel the weight of it. Every scam that once felt clever now sits on a growing pile of evidence. Every shortcut eventually leads somewhere, and increasingly, that somewhere looks like a prison cell. When his appeals failed, Swedish authorities made arrangements to deport him back to the United States, back to the country he had fled, back to the Warrens. back to the charges, back to the life he had been trying to outrun. The game appeared finished. You're handcuffed. You're watched. You're being transported across an ocean. The authorities believe they've finally won, and by any reasonable measure, they have. But if Frank Abagnale's story is remembered for anything, it's his ability to look at a situation and ask one question. Where's the weakness? Because somewhere during that journey home, a story would emerge that would help make him famous. A story involving an airplane, a bathroom, and an escape that sounded almost impossible. What happened next depends largely on whose version of the story you believe. Over the years, Frank Abagnale told audiences a dramatic tale about his return journey to the United States after his arrests in Europe. According to Abagnale, he was being transported back to America under guard. The game was over. The running was finished. The authorities had finally caught up. You're handcuffed. You're exhausted. You're surrounded by people whose job it is to make sure you don't get away. Every door is locked. Every route is blocked. Every move is being watched. Or at least that's how it's supposed to be. Because if you've spent years surviving through deception, you develop a habit. You stop looking at obstacles. You start looking for weaknesses. A distracted guard, a poorly secured door, a routine nobody questions, an assumption everyone else takes for granted. According to Abagnale's later account, somewhere during the flight, he asked to use the bathroom. A simple request, an ordinary moment, the kind of moment nobody remembers. Until it changes everything. As the story goes, once inside the lavatory, Frank began examining his surroundings. You're trapped, you're cornered. So your eyes start searching. A latch, a hinge, a panel, an opportunity, anything, something. According to Abagnale, he found it. He claimed he removed part of the lavatory assembly, slipped into a service area beneath the aircraft, and effectively vanished while authorities searched for him. When the bathroom door was eventually opened, he was gone. At least, that's the version of events that would later appear in interviews, speeches, books, and retellings. It's also one of the reasons historians and journalists have spent years debating parts of the Frank Abagnale story. Some details remain difficult to independently verify. Others have been challenged by later investigations. But regardless of precisely what happened on that flight, one thing is undeniable. The story was perfect. A captured con man, an impossible escape, embarrassed authorities, an international search. The kind of tale people want to believe because it sounds too incredible to be invented. And for years, it helped fuel the image of Frank Abagnale as a criminal mastermind who could escape almost any situation. Could he really have slipped away through an airplane lavatory? Could he really have turned certain capture into another getaway? Or had the story grown larger with every retelling? Whatever the truth, the legend kept growing. And before long, Frank Abagnale would be back in America, creating new identities, new victims, and even bigger stories. Because the airplane escape was only one chapter in a much larger myth. And whether every detail happened exactly the way or not, the story would become part of the Frank Abagnale legend. After returning to the United States in 1970, Frank Abagnale wasn't done reinventing himself. If anything, the stories were getting bigger. This time, he arrived at the University of Arizona with a convincing pitch. He claimed to have connections to Pan America World Airways. He claimed to be a pilot. And he claimed he was helping recruit future flight attendants. It's another reminder of something Frank had learned years earlier. You don't need everyone to believe you. You only need enough people to believe you. And often, the easiest way to gain trust is to borrow it from an institution people already respect. An airline, a uniform, a title, a confident introduction. According to university officials, Abagnale interacted with multiple female students who believed they were participating in a legitimate recruitment process. The interviews seemed real. The opportunity seemed real. And because the opportunity seemed real, many never questioned the man presenting it. You learn that people rarely verify a good story immediately, especially when the story offers something they want: a career, an opportunity, a future. But this wasn't harmless role-playing. This wasn't a prank. According to later investigations, Abagnale conducted physical examinations on applicants despite having no medical qualifications whatsoever. The victims believed they were dealing with someone connected to a major airline. Instead, they were dealing with a fraud. It's important to remember that behind every successful con are real people. People who trusted. People who were manipulated. People who were used. By now, Frank's confidence had grown enormously. Each successful deception reinforced the same belief. If the story is convincing enough, people will fill in the gaps themselves. But every new scam created new risks, more victims, more complaints, more attention. And unlike before, some of that attention was now coming from federal authorities. Could Frank keep talking his way out of trouble? Could another identity save him? Or had he finally pushed his luck too far? Because the stories were getting bigger, the risks were getting bigger, and the FBI was finally paying attention. By 1970, Frank Abagnale's scam had finally attracted the kind of attention he could no longer talk his way out of. Federal attention. One of the most common schemes involving cashing fraudulent checks designed to resemble Pan Am payroll checks. The idea was simple. If the check looked legitimate, many businesses wouldn't question it. And for a while, the scheme worked. Frank passed fraudulent checks across multiple states, moving constantly and relying on the same formula that had carried him this far. A convincing story, a confident smile, and the assumption that nobody would look too closely. But eventually, someone did. On November 2, 1970, Abagnale was arrested in Georgia after investigators connected him to a series of forged checks. For most people, that would have been the end. For Frank, it was just another problem to solve. Even in custody, you keep looking for weaknesses. A distracted guard, an unlocked door, a moment nobody expects. Remarkably, he managed to escape from the local jail. For a few days, it looked like he might disappear again. But this wasn't a Hollywood movie. The escape didn't launch an international cat and mouse chase. It didn't trigger a globe-spanning manhunt. 4 days later, authorities found him in New York City. Caught. Again. The courts weren't impressed. Abagnale was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison. with additional time added because of the escape. And that's where the real Frank Abagnale story starts to diverge from the version many people know. Not a criminal mastermind staying 10 steps ahead of everyone. Not an untouchable supervillain crossing continents. Just a talented fraudster who repeatedly got caught, repeatedly ran, and repeatedly found himself back in custody. But here's the fascinating part. Prison didn't destroy Frank Abagnale's future. In some ways, it created it. Because behind bars, a different opportunity was beginning to emerge. An opportunity that would eventually make him far more famous than any check he ever forged. And unlike his earlier scams, millions of people would willingly buy into this one. For most convicted fraudsters, prison marks the end of the story. For Frank Abagnale, it became the beginning of a completely new one. After his release, he faced a problem. His criminal record followed him everywhere. Jobs were hard to find. Trust was hard to earn. And for someone whose entire life had revolved around deception, legitimate opportunities were limited. So Frank tried something different. Instead of hiding his past, he sold it. In 1975, he approached a bank with an unusual offer. If his knowledge of fraud proved useful, they could pay him. If it didn't, they owed him nothing. It was a simple pitch, and it worked. Because who better to explain how fraudsters operate than someone who had actually committed fraud? For the first time in your life, you don't need to run. You don't need a fake identity. You don't need forged documents. The very thing that once got you arrested can now earn you a paycheck. One bank became 2. 2 became 10. Soon, Frank was speaking to financial institutions, corporations, and government agencies about fraud prevention and document security. He founded his own consulting company, built a reputation, built a career, and in fairness, there was a genuine intelligence behind it. Many criminals understand how to exploit systems. Very few successfully turn that knowledge into a legitimate business. Frank had found a way to profit from his past without repeating it, at least legally. But there was one complication. The stories kept growing. The more audiences listened, the more they wanted to hear. A fraudster became a master conman. A master conman became an international fugitive. A criminal record became an adventure story. And with every retelling, the line between documented history and legend became a little harder to see. Before long, Frank Abagnale wouldn't just be known for the crimes he actually committed, he would become famous for crimes that millions of people believe he committed. And that distinction would change everything. In 1980, Frank Abagnale published Catch Me If You Can. It would change his life. The autobiography told the story of a young con man who allegedly impersonated a Pan Am pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and even a university professor while cashing millions of dollars in fraudulent checks across dozens of countries. It was everything audiences loved. Adventure, deception, escapes, near captures. A charismatic outlaw always one step ahead of the authorities, and people couldn't get enough of it. The book became a success. Then the legend grew even larger. In 2002, director Steven Spielberg brought the story to the big screen. Leonardo DiCaprio played Frank. Tom Hanks played the determined FBI agent pursuing him. The film became a hit. A Broadway musical followed. Millions of people who had never heard of Frank Abagnale suddenly knew his name, and for many of them, the movie version became the real version. You can almost understand why. It's a fantastic story. You're flying around the world, outsmarting the FBI, pretending to be whoever you want to be. Every problem has a clever solution. Every close call becomes another escape. It's the perfect con man fantasy. And with every interview, speech, and public appearance, Frank's reputation continued to grow. By now, he wasn't just a former criminal. He was an icon, a reformed fraudster who had supposedly transformed his extraordinary criminal past into a successful consulting career. But success creates scrutiny, and eventually some journalists start asking questions. Not about the movie, not about the legend, about the records, the court files, the prison documents, the date. And the more closely they looked, the more difficult it became to make parts of the story fit. Could Frank really have done everything he claimed? Could the timeline actually work? Or was the world's most famous conman about to face a very different kind of investigation? Because for the first time in decades, people weren't chasing Frank Abagnale. They were chasing the truth. For years, almost nobody questioned the story. Why would they? It was entertaining, inspiring even. A former conman reforms his life, helps the FBI, and teaches the world about fraud. It's a great narrative, but beginning in the late 1970s, a handful of journalists started looking closer, and they kept finding the same problem: records, or more specifically, the lack of them. Abagnale had claimed to be a lawyer. Investigators couldn't find evidence he had ever passed the Louisiana bar exam. He claimed to have worked in the Louisiana Attorney General's office. Officials couldn't find employment records. He claimed to have worked as a supervising pediatrician in Georgia. Hospital administrators challenged the story. He claimed to have taught sociology at Brigham Young University. That claim was questioned too. Even some of his statements about working with the FBI came under scrutiny. The deeper reporters dug, the more inconsistencies appeared. Then, in 2020, author Alan C. Logan published an extensive investigation built around court documents, prison records, and historical archives. The findings raised a major issue. According to the records, Frank spent much of the period during which his most famous adventures supposedly occurred incarcerated at Great Meadow Prison. You can explain away one missing document, maybe two, but prison records are harder to ignore. Suddenly, the timeline starts looking very different. And if the timeline doesn't work, what else doesn't work? 2 years later, investigative journalist Javier Leiva confronted Abagnale directly with court records and prison documents. The questions were simple. Did these events happen? Did the dates match? Could the story be proven? For decades, Frank made a career out of understanding belief. After all, if people want a bigger story, why give them a smaller one? That's what makes the Frank Abagnale story so fascinating. Not because every claim is necessarily false, and not because every claim is necessarily true, but because it raises a question almost nobody thought to ask for decades. Did Frank Abagnale pull off two great cons? The first with forged checks, and the second with the story he told about them. Because the more investigators looked, the clearer it became that Frank's most famous creation might not have been a fake identity. It might have been Frank Abagnale himself. So what should we make of Frank Abagnale? What's true? What's exaggerated? And what may never be fully answered? The documented record is clear on some things. Frank committed fraud. He forged checks. He stole cars. He impersonated authority figures. He served time in prison. Those facts aren't in dispute. The debate begins when the story expands beyond the court records. The pilot, the doctor, the lawyer, the professor, the globe-spanning manhunt, the millions of dollars in fraudulent checks. Over the years, many of those claims have been challenged by journalists, researchers, and official records. That doesn't necessarily mean every story is false, but it does mean many of them remain unproven. And that's what makes the Frank Abagnale story so unusual. Most con artists deceive people in the moment. Frank may have done something far rarer. He may have convinced millions of people to believe a version of his life story. You can almost admire the irony. A man who built his early life around fake identities eventually became famous for an identity of his own creation. Whether that identity was entirely real, partly real, or heavily embellished is still debated. But one fact isn't. Frank Abagnale became one of the most recognisable con men in the world. Not because of what he stole, because of the story. And ultimately, whether Frank was a master criminal, a master storyteller, or some combination of both, one fact is impossible to ignore. For decades, he convinced millions of people that he was the smartest man in the room. Hollywood believed it. Audiences believed it. And in many cases, the media believed it too. Even today, people are still debating where the facts end and the legend begins. And maybe that's the most fascinating part of all. Because Frank Abagnale didn't just build false identities. He may have built an entire mythology. If you want another story about a criminal who turned patience, planning, and deception into an art form, check out the video popping up on your screen now, where we explore how a master thief used a $50 baby monitor to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from a bank.